Hello and good afternoon, and hopefully welcome back to the Psychedelics Now conference. This is our third and final panel of the day. Time flies when you're discussing psychedelics because the last 3 hours have just been blistering, unlike time when you're on psychedelics, which tends to slow down, but I digress a little bit. We've covered some really fascinating topics today. Our first panel discussion was Clearing the Haze, What's Legal Today. It was a very spirited and lively conversation with some great industry leaders and thought leaders. Our second panel was Ketamine Clinics, Do's and Don'ts. We could have used more than an hour on that. We had some, again, great industry leaders and thought leaders. And we're going to round things up today with our third panel, Interested in Investing in Psychedelics. I know I have been interested and have been investing in psychedelics for a while, and I suspect a large portion of our audience is interested in hearing insights from some of the great content providers that we're about to hear from about all facets of investing in psychedelics. Given that psychedelics seem to be on the precipice of legalization or decriminalization, depending on which jurisdiction we're referring to, and institutions, family offices, high net worth individuals are looking at early stage investments in this new market. There is a raft of investment opportunities. Dozens of companies have already gone public in North America on the Canadian Securities Exchange, the TSX, and also on the NASDAQ. And we're going to see that trend continuing. I'm so pleased to introduce our moderator today, Ms. Anna Serene, Director of Listing Development at the aforementioned Canadian Securities Exchange. Ms. Serene has 20 years of experience in securities and corporate finance. She has an unwavering passion, perseverance, and commitment to the capital markets and to the investment industry. And she started her education in business and psychology, accomplished her brokerage and wealth management designations with honors, and really has played a seminal role in listing all sorts of companies on the CSC, including cannabis companies and now psychedelic companies. Without further ado, Anna, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for such a nice introduction. Also, thank you for putting this investment opportunity together. I know that there's lots of questions around what to invest in, how to invest in the psychedelic space. I have a wonderful panel today joining me, and we're going to dive into a bunch of it. The reason the CSE is here is we now currently, last year we did an Investing in Psychedelics forum, and I think at the time we might have had about 6 companies listed with us focused in the space. 1 year later, and we have 36 companies. So it is a very fast growing sector, and there's lots to learn if you want to invest in it. So luckily I'm joined by some experts today that can help us dive into the opportunity there. There will be a portion at the end where you can ask some Q&A, or you're welcome to reach out to any of us anytime after if you have questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel today. I'm joined by Greg Benson, CEO of Relief Therapeutics, Harrison Keenan, Senior VP of Canaccord Genuity, Josh Lawler, partner at Zuber Lawler, and Rick Paulman is founder of NCG Group. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I know that we probably don't have enough time to get into everything, so we're gonna try and do as much as we can with the time that we have. Also, thank you to the audience who has stuck around. I know these are long forums, but there's definitely worthwhile for all the content coming out. I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves and just tell us a little bit about why you're involved in the psychedelic space, what your role is in the space. Greg, let's start with you.
Sure. So I've well, first of all, thanks for the intro, Anna. But so I started in the healthcare world, in the international healthcare world, for about 15 years now, where I owned an international healthcare company. From there, about 5 years ago, I got into the medical cannabis space, but more on the clinic side of things as opposed to the product side. So now what I'm looking at doing is kind of that same thing and taking a lot of the experience that I've received from the medical cannabis space and really turning that into the same thing into the psychedelics. So really looking at the clinic side of providing access for patients, and also really on the education side and making sure that we educate HCPs, we educate public, and we also educate patients.
Thank you, Greg. And, you know, I think with these emerging sectors, education is probably the pinnacle of everything, you know, even from the investment side. So thank you very much for that. Harrison, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Harrison Keenan from Toronto, Canada. I've been here on Bay Street for 20 years as a professional investor. One of the big banks started out here in Canada, and subsequently found my way to a smaller but still large and quickly growing firm called Canaccord Genuity, which I think many of you will be familiar with. The Canaccord specializes in sort of leading edge technologies, and we've done a pretty good job of getting involved in things like blockchain and cannabis early on. Done a lot of financing in both of those areas, and starting I guess 2 or 3 years ago, as it became more and more clear that psychedelics were going to be a real thing and get the I think the attention and the legitimacy that it's deserved. We certainly delved into that. So I've been active in that for about the last 2.5 years.
Wonderful, thank you. I was going to say, Canaccord really has been a bit of a thought leader in these emerging sectors, and really has become the banker for a lot of these things coming to market. So thank you for everything that you guys have done. Josh, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Anna. So I'm Josh Lawler. I am partner at the law firm Zuber Lawler. I practice securities law, mergers and acquisitions, finance. I've done a great deal in the cannabis space, probably a couple $2 billion worth of transactions. Our firm has been in cannabis for 14 or 15 years, and it sort of naturally followed that we would be in psychedelics as well, which sort of found us as much as we found it. We are specialists in pretty much the entire legal aspect of the industry, whether it be regulatory or patent prosecution or corporate, or hopefully at some point soon FDA approval work, and as it goes. And we see a large number of companies in the space and are exposed to a large number of different businesses and business models.
Wonderful, thank you. A big part of this discussion around investing in psychedelics is also the fact that these companies require, an extreme amount of disclosure, and that's really important to have those professionals helping these companies. Rick, we'll end off with you. Tell us about yourself. You're on mute.
Hi, I'm Rick Palmone. I've had a 20-year career as an institutional portfolio manager, focusing in credit and trading across the capital structure as well. About 6 months ago, I decided to leave the street and focus on something a little bit more soul satisfying. And I founded NCG Group, which is a family office and a consultancy. And our focus is on direct investments, both in the public and the private psychedelic space, as well as providing advisory services to companies in the space. And also we're focused on charitable work and making sure that psychedelics are accessible to all sorts of people of all different ethnicities, colors, and socioeconomic classes.
Amazing. Thank you, Rick. I ended off with you, Rick, because I'm actually going to direct the first question to you and then open it up to the panel. I thought it was important for us to discuss where we're seeing some of these opportunities lie. So could you maybe kind of break down the current landscape as far as the different structures that we're seeing come to market?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the market breaks down into three segments, really. The first segment is private companies. So those are, I think the traditional, angel, VC, accelerator type companies. They range from, valuations as low as 5 million to even as much as like, 250 million plus. And I think those companies follow, not a trajectory very dissimilar to biotechs. Looking at the management team, looking at their IP profile, and garnering interest that way. Where I think the space has gotten very interesting is then if we look at the public subset, and that's a bit of a barbell. So we've got what we call the gorillas in the room, which are the NASDAQ companies, the Compasses and the Atais. But then you've also got a whole handful. At this point, it's probably north of 20 companies that have gone public in Canada, taking advantage of the buoyant capital markets over the last 6 months. And I think that's where it's a very interesting space. These micro caps, range from 30 million to maybe 250 million. And that space, has stigma in the past because particularly U.S. investors are wondering, well, why wouldn't they just stay private and take VC money? Why would they go public in Canada? But the truth of the matter is that the capital markets are available, and the speed at which this industry has progressed has made it a much quicker option in order to raise money, to allow the markets to determine the valuation and not a few anchor VC funds. And I think focusing on that microcap subsector, which in some cases can be unloved by the general population, is where you can generate really outsized returns. So we can debate whether a tie is worth 3 billion or 5 billion, but it doesn't seem like anybody's calling it for it to be a $50 billion company, right? And on the other hand, if you look at the companies in like that $30 to $50 million market cap, I believe that if a tie is in fact even worth 3 billion, many of those companies are at least $1 billion companies. So you have real opportunity to generate 20x returns. While at the same time, as we know with microcaps, some of them will not succeed. So I think the portfolio approach and picking the winners in that microcap subspace is very interesting and something that I've spent a lot of time on. And I don't think that there's a lot of people that who focus on that enough.
Well, and you mentioned actually how many companies have come to Canada. We have currently on the CSE 36, and I know there's other ones on other exchanges in Canada. So I think it's growing super quickly, kind of in the small to mid cap space in Canada, much quicker than I think anyone anticipated. Josh, I'll move over to you here. What are you seeing? Are you seeing an interest in the go public route, or are they able to raise money privately? What are you seeing from a corporate perspective as you deal with these companies?
Well, there's definitely a great interest in getting public pretty much as quickly as possible, which is going to lead to a lot of public microcaps, also going to lead to a lot of public companies that, as Rick was saying, don't ultimately make it. But you mentioned the buoyant capital markets, and that's still kind of the atmosphere that people are looking at. So it's kind of as old as there have been markets that if people think that they can get onto a public market and there's liquidity, that they'll attract more funding and higher valuations, and that's all true. So that's happening maybe a little bit faster than it should, because a number of companies are popping up that don't really even have models yet. They have ideas and they're putting a team together as they go, but darn it, they're going to get public sooner or later. Or sooner, I suppose I should say. That's happening.
Well, and I think you bring up a really good point there. We saw this in the cannabis space, and I think the psychedelic space is had a bit of an interesting run because really, I was a little surprised when this really started to come to market, and the appetite from investors to invest in the space, I think, is really driving some of this, right? And as you said, maybe some are a little too early stage, but they're able to go to market, they're able to raise the capital, and they're running out there. Harrison, you went off, so I can move back to you, but I was going to move to you next just to see kind of what you've seen. If you're busy though, I can move to Greg. Greg, you've obviously raised capital in the space. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the sentiment has been there?
Yeah, I think the keys, is when you're raising capital or you're looking at going public, is to really see what the company is doing. What are the products and services that they're offering? Are they able to provide access to patients? And how are they doing that? Is it through brick and mortar clinics? Is it through virtual? So I think there's a lot of different things when you're looking at individual companies, just to really be able to see what they are that's offering, because there are a lot of different parts to the industry. And what we've seen in the cannabis side was at the very beginning was a lot of the licensed producers and not so much on the clinic side. So I think we really need to be able to take a look at all the different parts of the industry and really analyze to see where that company does fit.
And there's so many different areas of that. And we're going to talk about what the different areas of the sector are. Harrison, if you're able to chat, can you maybe talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing? Are you investing in some of the private companies that are pre-IPO and helping them take that bridge? Are you just focusing on the public companies? Where is your practice within this sector?
My practice includes all of the above, Anna, but I would say the most interesting part for me right now is the private companies and those that are just forming, and former cannabis companies that have now pivoted and looking for, maybe they weren't as successful in the cannabis space, but now they've found something interesting in the psychedelic realm. So there's a lot, as everyone has alluded to, there's a lot going on in that space. Right now it's a major land grab to figure out where the puck is going, what has not been sort of thought of as a concept or a geography, or where can we go with this in terms of a new niche to carve out for a company that's up and coming and looking to do something in the space. So, I mean, some of the names that have been mentioned, the Atais, the Compasses, want to move to some of the larger Canadian listed companies like Cybin, MindMed, and Field Trip. They have pretty defined business models and business plans at this point. So now it's just a question of where everyone else can fit into to the overall scheme of things. And it's interesting to see the different groups that are sort of targeting those areas. So that's been I mean, I obviously keep track of the listed ones and keep a close eye on them, but I've been spending more time on the early stage ones and just seeing where people think they could fit into the whole thing.
So I have a question for you on that. You say early stage. I mean, the one thing about this sector is this is not a new sector. In fact, from my understanding, there could be more data and research that's been done on it than in the cannabis space. So this is not new. It's just new to capital markets.
Right.
When you say kind of early stage, are these companies that have been around for a while and management teams that have been in the psychedelic space for a long time? Or is this, are you finding that you're kind of having to weed through various projects to find something that's a little bit more built out?
Yeah, no, sorry, that's a good clarification. This is early stage in terms of the capital markets and figuring out their whole listing scheme. But yes, so a lot of them have been around for a long time in various stages. It's just a question of putting together a team that, maybe you don't have someone who's capital market savvy. You need someone like that. Maybe the CEO is a great private market CEO, but you want someone who can be a more public face, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the kinds of things that people are looking at. And then there's obviously the ones that are actually early stage in terms of businesses trying to figure out their own niche within the sector.
Absolutely. And that must be a challenge for you guys as you do your work and due diligence to maybe to figure out who's gonna be able to make it within the capital markets. Josh, I'm gonna move to you next. And I just wanted you to maybe break down, obviously there was a lot of content given out today, but we didn't even touch the surface, I think. What are the kind of high level areas of the sector? So if I'm an investor looking to invest in the space, obviously it's not just all, one thing. What are the different areas of the sector?
Right. So, first off, I want to echo Rick's thought that really a portfolio approach is a really good one at this point because, I certainly can't pick winners. I'm not sure if anybody on the panel can pick winners. I have a great belief in the space, but, there's a giant run at different things right now, and it's very, very confused. So to answer your question, there's obviously kind of a medical pharma aspect to it. And there's a lot of different companies that are chasing a lot of different indications with a lot of different psychoactive substances, and they're not necessarily even all sure whether they're going to be psilocybin or DMT or MDMA or ketamine, or the list goes on. And that can be for everything from addiction to dementia to Crohn's disease, and things that seem, not to be really related at all. So not having a medical background myself, you can kind of look at the team and great. So beyond the medicinal, you've got a nutraceutical aspect to it. So, think of that as the supplement companies, and there's folks who are making kind of microdosing available in Canada, hopefully in the United States at some point. But that's one thing. There is a rec market. It's not huge. I don't think it's ever going to approach, the cannabis rec market as far as size goes, just because of the nature of what we're talking about. But it's definitely there. And then there are some, pick and shovel type companies that might be, drug discovery, or using artificial intelligence, machine learning to screen for, different compounds. And they might be somebody who's, hired by, one of the pharmaceutical companies to assist in the drug discovery process. And then there's a couple that have libraries of molecules that they have rights to, that they allow people access to. I think that covers most of it. Oh, and lawyers, lots of lawyers.
Always, we need you guys around. You brought up something interesting in our pre-chat, that this is a very heavily focused medicinal play. This is not like cannabis where it's recreational. The two sectors are quite different. And it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out, because it's also, I think people might hear the word psychedelic and I think that intrigues them, but this is a mental well-being. I mean, the uses it's used for is severe post-traumatic stress disorders and severe depression, suicidal thoughts. It really is dealing with a lot of mental well-being, which I didn't know about until I started looking at it last year. I'm quite blown away with some of the work it's doing. I mean, I think it's a sector that will stay in the capital markets, but like any other emerging sector, there's going to be a lot of different avenues. Greg, you have kind of 4 pillars that you think are kind of the basics, the crux of the sector as a whole. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So I think the first part is exactly just to echo what you guys were saying, is on the medicinal side. So the importance with that is be able to have physicians so that patients have access to. And what we've seen on the cannabis side of things is that the general practitioners, and they still aren't today, comfortable writing in their own practices. So there is certainly an importance to have these clinics out there that specialize in these types of treatments so that patients can access. The second part, as I mentioned earlier, was education, and education is so important. And there's 3 real types that I look at when we look at education. It is educating the physicians and educating the psychotherapists and the psychiatrists and so forth, so that they understand a lot more what's going on with this treatment. And I think the second part with education, which is really important, is the patient. So they have an expectation that they're going to have with this treatment. So it's really important to have that follow-up with them as well, and have that continued support for a patient throughout their whole therapy. And then the last part would be to try and really break down the barriers and the stigma out there, is to educate the public. And I think once we talk more and more, as we have on the cannabis side of things, we've seen the stigma come down, although it's not totally gone, but we have seen those barriers start to break down. So I think that's kind of the same thing that we need to see in the psychedelic side as well. Product. That's going to be so important. Regulated product. When any type of product that we look at medicinally, there's 2 words that come into play, and that's efficacy and safety. So we really need to be able to show these things, which we have, but I think that needs to continue on more so that we can educate the public more on those 2 things. And then the last part is patients. And I think with patients, we need to be able to have research platforms for patients to be able to access. I think we need to be able to have, like I was mentioning earlier, the clinics and so forth, to be able to have a place for them to go. But I think if we really, look at those 4 pillars, I think it is success for an industry to succeed if we look at those 4 things.
Thank you, Greg. Rick, on that note, just everything that Greg just talked about, it seems like there's still a lot of work that we have to do to get the market really to open up to this sector. Do you see these things, these catalysts, these things that need to happen to further the sector? Do you see these as now opportunities? Do we have a way to go when you're looking at these companies? How close are we?
Well, I mean, I think more than anything, what's going to be driving this sector is the science, because the stigma has a lot to do with social elements and media and all these other kind of very subjective and sometimes biased situations. But I think what we can all agree upon is the scientists, and when you have work that's coming out of Johns Hopkins and NYU and Imperial College, And you're seeing studies that are being done in extremely rigorous FDA approved fashion, going through the 3 phases. And when you see MAPS come out with 65% efficacy on their MDMA for PTSD study, or psilocybin, Johns Hopkins has a psilocybin to treat nicotine addiction that shows over 80% effectiveness versus 25% on the patch. And it's very hard to argue with that. And it's also very hard for anybody to make a case that this should not be available to people who need it. It's been very clear that the current modalities don't work. SSRIs have really not been effective. If anything, they dull the pain, but they don't actually really help. And the numbers speak for itself. So once the science speaks, I think the investors will flock to it, and they clearly already have, right? And then we have seen, for now, it's only a handful of what we would call like the gorillas in the room that are getting the institutional capital. But from my seat, as I try and bridge, institutional money that's not, historically invested in sort of nascent fringe industries, I'm starting to see them getting very interested. Like little things like, when the front page of the New York Times comes out with the MAPS MDMA study, and I get like 25 text messages on Sunday night, that tells me something. People are seeing it, people are listening. And what'll end up happening is people will not want to miss the opportunity, and they're going to see the Atais of the world and people making outsized returns, and they're going to be looking for the next one, and hopefully between the science and the sort of a rigorous investment strategy, we'll have sort of validators in the space, and that's what I think will drive this from being a retail, investment product to actually an institutional one. And, we've seen it in crypto, seen it in electric vehicles. And when that happens, the assets will reflate, and you can see some really incredible moves in valuation. So that's, that to me is the be all end all. And I think we're going to start to get data points coming out, MAPS just had theirs in the next 6 months to a year. And then after that, there will probably be some waiting period, because, it's that last mile at the FDA is always very challenging. And as Josh said, none of us can predict, who's actually going to get that approval, because sometimes there's an element of randomness. But if you have a portfolio, and the science is there, there's definitely going to be winners.
Thank you for that, Rick. Harrison, that brings up a question I wanted to ask you. I have, my next question is for Josh, but I'm going to jump to you quickly. Do you think, what we saw in the cannabis space was such a desire and appetite for the sector that perhaps some companies were overvalued based on their actual fundamentals? And there was a moment in time that was really difficult for the sector because the companies that actually had the fundamentals didn't match the companies that maybe had, a market cap that they didn't necessarily deserve based on the fundamentals, just purely based on interest in the space. Are you seeing that at all in the psychedelic space? Do you think they might go through a similar issue?
And I'm shocked to hear you say that you think maybe one of the cannabis companies might have been overvalued at some point.
No, did I say that
out loud? No, look, obviously, once you're public, anything can happen. Your stock is worth whatever people think it's worth at any given moment, and valuation is in the eye of the beholder. So I mean, look, some of these companies don't have a lot now, and their valuations are based solely on future promise. Maybe they've done a good job of marketing, better than other companies in terms of marketing to investors and getting the word out there, and getting some interest and articles and whatnot. maybe just some others have a capital structure that's more favorable than others. So yes, right now, I mean, the market is still trying to figure out who the winners are going to be, which is exactly why my fellow panelists have both suggested the shotgun approach. Just sort of buy a bunch of different ones because you don't know who the actual winner is going to be. So at this point, yeah, valuation doesn't tell the whole story. It's all going to play out. There's going to be waves of different investors coming in and out, depending on results and various news flows over the next few months and years. And it's, we're not going to know. We're still trying to figure out really in the cannabis sector who the winners and losers are going to be. I mean, to a large extent, I think that's a fait accompli, but that took, sort of 5 to 6 years of capital markets before that became clearer. So yeah, of course, there's going to be some that in hindsight will be very expensive relative to their true worth over time, and some that are cheap, and we won't know till we know.
And I think that's really important for people to consider when wanting to invest in the space. You need to consider, are you playing on the market or are you playing on the fundamentals of the company? You need to decide for yourself how you approach it. Josh, you said something that was really interesting to me. You said this is a catalyst-driven market. Can you touch on that a little bit more? What does that mean, and what catalysts need to occur for the sector to continue to boom?
Sure, absolutely. And it's actually funny that you mentioned that on the heels of Harrison's response, because he mentioned some companies being better at media and communications and communicating to investors. And a lot of the catalysts are really driven in that way. And how much can somebody make of what they've got to work with? So as Rick was saying, MAPS comes out and has its study and those results. That's a catalyst that can lift really the entire market. It shows up in the New York Times and everybody kind of starts looking around and going, okay. And then you see, a bunch of retail investors who kind of look at it and say, okay, shotgun approach. Let me invest in, 10 of these companies. And, if enough people do that, it lifts the market cap of everybody. Then you've got, obviously company specific types of things, which is, FDA, approval if it ever happens, obviously. But right now, a lot of partnerships being announced. This company and that company are going to get together and try to work for, particular indications. We've got a lot of, a certain scientist at a university has joined us as an advisor type of announcements, and, that can drive things. And, at the end of the day, not a lot of this actually says who's going to ultimately have a marketable product or business model. But in terms of, where the retail investor goes, that's kind of something that allows somebody to latch onto a particular name, and also from a lawyer perspective makes us all very cautious about how things are announced and that type of thing. And I'm not sure all these companies are always running things past their lawyers in terms of how they release information to the media, but that's a different story.
Well, and I think I brought that up earlier. Disclosure is just it's the fundamental of capital markets, even private companies that have to deal with their shareholders. Disclosure is really important, and I know that the regulators have stepped in as this market has started to boom and said, you're not disclosing enough. You're not disclosing it properly. You need to go back to the drawing board and redo this. So everyone's kind of figuring it out as they go, and you just hope that as a potential investor that you're doing your due diligence and reading disclosure requirements or disclosure documents and understanding what this company is doing on a further level. Greg, a question for you. I'm just curious what your thoughts on. You talk about kind of the education, patients, getting physicians on board. Are you seeing an interest level from the big pharma companies? Where do they stand in this moment? Because obviously, that's the pools of capital there are endless, right?
Right. So I think with big pharma, one of the things that we see with them where the interest is when products can actually have a DIN number and be on the shelves of pharmacies where they're actually able to produce their products there, or have their products set there. So I think, there's certainly the eyes of most of the pharmaceutical companies are there. How much they're putting in right this second, I really don't know at that point, but I think there's certainly a big interest. And then, I think we talked about this industry being around for a while, but I still think it's in its infancy stage. And I still think that there's, you know, hurdles and bumps and different curves that we need to understand that are going to be along the way. So I think that, you know, there is a big interest for sure with big pharma, but I'm not sure to what degree right this second they're ready just to jump in yet.
And this is, I kind of want to ask this question of all of you, but do you think it's kind of like the mining sector, where really the real opportunity is you find a reserve and then you sell to one of the majors? Do you think some of these small to mid cap companies, really kind of the end hope is that you do your research, you get your FDA approval, you create your product, whatever side of the sector you're in, and you get bought out by one of the big pharmas? Is that, do you think, the ultimate dream kind of for these small to mid caps?
I think they're certainly on the minds of a lot. You know, we do know that there's a lot of interest right now with the generic companies that have done deals and partnerships in the cannabis space, and it's certainly going to be there in the psychedelic space as well. So I think at the end of the day, yeah, when big pharma comes in, that's certainly something that that companies will look at.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people that are looking at GW Pharma, Jazz as an example of what can happen if you can get something through FDA approval in the space. I think there's a lot of that. I think there's probably more companies that are looking at getting it through the phase 2 clinical and having, you know, enough positive results there that they can possibly then license out or sell to a company that's got more resources to get it through phase 3.
Rick, this is a question for Rick and Harrison, if I could get both of your inputs on this. One other thing, and I mean, I really do hate to continue to compare this to the cannabis space because they are very separate. They, you know, the interest might be the same from certain investors, but they live very different existence as companies. But one thing that we saw in the cannabis space was this massive roll up. Just, you know, a company got big enough, was able to raise enough capital, and all they did was gobble up whatever they could, and it ended up just this massive conglomerate of you know, small companies that they absorbed. I don't know if that's necessarily
talking about any canopy in particular.
Harrison, I'm not talking about anyone in particular. So Harrison, what do you think about that? Are we going to see consolidation? Do you think we're going to see a bunch of little guys build up and then just the big package deal?
Absolutely. Yeah, no question. Yeah. No, it's a total land grab right now, and just as we saw in cannabis, again, not to compare them because they are different, and they get to get obviously a lot more medical focus with psychedelics, but yeah, no, it's who gets big the fastest. That's the game, and there'll be lots of merger talks, and definitely some many brought to fruition.
Yeah.
You know, I think the interesting thing there is something we haven't really talked about it, but there's two sorts of companies in the space, and there's the ones that are following more of the holding company approach, like a Thai, or where they've, you know, just been sort of buying up a lot of different companies, as opposed to the ones that are sort of more looking to grow organically and vertically. And I think right now, with the buoyancy of the capital markets, and when your stock, you know, affords you the high valuation and the ability to use it as a currency to buy all these other companies, you know, that's an effective approach. You know, but if we hit any like turbulence in the market, you know, I think it's going to be really important that you have companies that are vertically integrated that can, you know, exist on their own. And so, you know, for me, I've been actually, you know, focused more on the companies that I think are building organically, and not the ones that are just going out and buying assets and having, like, you know, 15 different, you know, ships at sea, hoping that one or two, you know, are effective. Because, you know, at the end of the day, you know, there's a bit of a bet on a management team, and I think you get a much more cohesive management team when you have a vertically integrated company, as opposed to one that's sort of a mishmash of you know, of 10 other ones. So, you know, I think it's happening, but, you know, I'd kind of caution against, you know, being too biased towards the companies that appear to have all these different ships at sea. Because, you know, the other thing that I focus a lot on is like, you know, everybody's very focused on, like, are you going to get your FDA approval? Are you going to make it through 3 phases? But, you know, not a lot of people are actually focused on, well, then what? Right? Like, just getting your drug approved doesn't actually mean that you're going to have revenue, right? I mean, psilocybin is a perfect example, right? I mean, you can get psilocybin approved to treat, you know, some condition. But if the modality is that it's a macro dose and you take it every 6 months, you know, 3 times, like, how do you actually make money doing that, right? You know, so there's a lot of intricacies, and I think there's not a lot of companies that have actually built out models, revenue models out 10 years, figuring out not only is our drug going to be, you know, approved, but how are we going to get this approved through insurance? How are we going to make this accessible? How are we going to make doctors not just accept the product, but actually adopt it and use it? And right, because like, if you look at an example like ketamine, Spravato is a perfect example. They got it through the FDA process, but it's not really covered by many insurances. And psychiatrists are very hesitant, if at all, to prescribe it. So it's really suffered, you know, and I think that, you know, that's why I've been focusing on the vertically integrated companies.
Right. You know, I think the one thing that's also important that you brought up is management teams. And that's something that Harrison probably tells all of his clients all day long, is in any sector is, or I would assume so, Harrison, I can't speak to your practice, but management teams is a really, really important part of any of these companies. And so you're right. It's, you know, it's not necessarily a bad opportunity if they're vertically integrated and have a bunch going on. I mean, look, some of these big companies out there that did do the big roll-ups, a lot of people made a lot of money. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. It'll just be interesting to see how this one plays out, because again, the cannabis space was, there's real estate opportunity, there's licensing opportunity, there's retail opportunity. You know, this is going to look and feel very different. One of my last kind of questions.
Rick made a good point. I mean, scale is not as important in biotech, right? So he's absolutely right about that. We won't see as much M&A on the pure biotech side.
Right. My last question, Harrison, maybe I'll end off with you, is I'd like to get a feel from you of, and this is from an investment perspective, because obviously the sector is going to continue to grow, and it's been wonderful to see the advancement that has done. It's wonderful to see it back. I think on people's minds, like you said, on the front of a newspaper, that people are considering this as a way to use medicinally. I worry about, you know, the opioid issues that we have as a society, and this might be able to help with a lot of things. So on that level, we'll continue to see that. But from an investment perspective, and I'm going to start with you, Harrison, what's next for this sector?
That's a good question. I mean,
Crystal ball time.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, my pipeline here is full of I think, you know, we're at 36 right now listed in Canada. I suspect that could double by the end of this year. So there's lots of them in the pipeline, that's for sure. Now, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a mix of everything. You got, I mean, one that I was talking to you guys about offline, where the business is primarily picks and shovels type things, where you're looking at, you know, selling solution for mushroom growers and things along that line. So it's a diverse group. And then you've got, you know, are you going to get into the food and beverage thing at some point? Do you have plans for that? Obviously, the clinics, there's lots of clinic interest still, and still a bunch of biotechs out there. So it's going to be a little bit of everything. But it looks like there's lots of companies still looking to list in the near term.
And the companies that you're looking at and reviewing, is money being thrown at them? Is it pretty easy for these companies to raise capital right now?
It's definitely tougher than, I mean, late last year, early this year, you know, sort of through February. We saw a huge investor interest. That's definitely come back. There's various reasons for that. I mean, the whole sort of speculative small cap areas of the market, and so even some of the US high multiple enterprise software companies, just valuations have come down, and I think they needed to. There was a bit of a speculative fervor earlier this year. So it's definitely tougher, but the market window is still open for sure.
Wonderful. Greg, what are your thoughts? What's next?
Yeah, so what I think is, the mental health part of things that has really gone on. There's a lot more awareness now. I think with mental health, I think, during COVID, during the pandemic, it's even been expressed that much more. And if we look at the treatments that have been out there, they're 30 plus years ago when the SSRIs and the Prozacs of the world really had a big hit. And there hasn't been a lot of advancement in mental health treatment since then. So I think right now when we're looking at this space and we're looking at treating, the depressions, the anxieties, the PTSDs, those types of things, I think this industry really has a lot to offer once the research and stuff is done.
So Greg, one question just on that note, because I think the one thing that is a little confusing maybe to people looking at the space is we're still also figuring out in jurisdictions how this can be given to patients and what the legal framework will look like. I mean, that obviously is a big part of what happens next as well, wouldn't you say?
It's a huge part. I mean, I think there's a huge part in terms of the access, and you're correct. And typically what we see with clinics is they're typically in the major urban centers. And when we look at rural patients, it's a challenge for them to get to these centers. We've seen that in cannabis as well. A lot of the cannabis clinics were set up at the beginning in these major centers. So access is certainly going to be, an issue, but I think there's ways obviously that companies will get innovative around that. And it's the same thing with products as well. It's, import, export, those types of things that always need to be considered.
Do you think there'll ever be a rec side to this market?
I think there's always a rec side. And I think the most important thing is to really differentiate between the two. And that's what we had to do in the cannabis space, is really say that there is two different streams here. There's a medical stream and there's a recreational stream. Although with psychedelics, I think the recreational is a lot less than what we'll see in the cannabis side. And I think it's, really focusing on the medicinal side right now. But I think there'll always be, a recreational side to it.
Right. Josh, what about you? What do you think is next? I mean, you kind of see these companies really before they start to come to market, and you help them build out kind of the corporate structure and everything in the background. What are you seeing? Because you're seeing stuff before we all see it. And where do you think this is going next?
Yeah, so at least in the US, it's really, I think, all regulatory. We're seeing states have, bills in the state legislature. In some cases, a couple of them have already passed to legalize, particularly medicinal, but some recreational also. And I think there's a couple of different things driving that. One of them is obviously cannabis has kind of beaten paths through the forest, if you will. So a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, associate the two and say, well, we legalized cannabis, why don't we legalize psychedelics also, as long as it's not, causing an opioid crisis or anything else. But the other piece of it that I think is really huge is that the indications that psychedelics is known to help with in terms of treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, these are very large indications that cost the government a lot of money. You've got all of the veterans with PTSD. It's really, I think, a situation where I think the legalization at the state levels is going to move a lot faster than people are thinking it will. And I think legalization at the federal level is likely to follow on also faster than people think it will. I won't say it'll happen before cannabis does, but I also wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, the process has been started. Rick, what about you? What do you think is next?
Well, I think in the very short term, I think what's next is going to be the path to institutionalization. So like we mentioned, 36 companies public in Canada, 2 in the United States. Right now, there's going to be, I think, a handful, 3 or 5 that go direct listing into the United States. But I think we're going to have to see, we saw MindMed uplist to the NASDAQ, and several of the other ones have now filed applications. But it's going to be very interesting to watch who can sort of, graduate from those the Canadian markets up to the NASDAQ and the big board. And those are, obviously going to garner a lot of attention. And as it relates to this whole, question about recreational versus medicinal, I think even I've learned, over the past few months that like the natural instinct of a psychonaut would be to say like, this should all be recreational, the government shouldn't tell us what to do and what not to do. But I think it does warrant like taking a pause and learning from sort of like the reality of the situation. And if we look at cannabis and if we look at ketamine, like, you know, yes, they are legal, but are they actually accessible? You know, can then, you know, Greg mentioned, you know, can the person in, you know, Kentucky who makes, you know, $40,000 a year, do they have access to ketamine? They don't. You know, do they have access to cannabis? I mean, look at the prices, you know, in the dispensaries. I mean, in a lot of cases, you were better off when it was in the black market from a pricing perspective, and that relates, you know, that's very important for the people that can't afford it. So I think that eventually it will become recreational. But I think it's really, really important that the thought leaders and the doctors and the scientists and the companies really make sure that we get the science right. Because like once something becomes recreational, then it's hard to then go back and try and like retrofit the science. Like it's going to be hard for cannabis to go back and have, like, who really wants to spend all the time running all these medical studies when it's just all available at the dispensary. And so with, you know, psilocybin, with MDMA, like we need to really iron it out. And then the other thing I think is, you know, clearly mental health is front and center and probably the low hanging fruit. But I think where we're going to see some real differentiation is for the really other approaches. So whether it's pain, you know, whether it's inflammation, all those types of sort of kind of where we've really just scratched the surface. And because, you know, something like inflammation, I think I once read something that like 70% of deaths have inflammation related to them. So, you know, those are like the kind of like next generation stuff. And then of course, you know, making these things more sort of fit the ecosystem. So these second generation psychedelics. So the psilocybin that doesn't last 6 hours, but it lasts 2 hours, that doesn't have the anxiety. You know, the MDMA that doesn't, you know, make you clench your jaw for, you know, the entire experience. Like those are very interesting and novel approaches that, you know, only real science can actually address, right? A PR firm can't do that, right? So, I mean, those are my, you know, high level.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Rick. I mean, I think thank you so much for all of your thoughts today. And you guys really you guys are the experts in the field. I really encourage people, if you're attending this, and thank you so much that we have a huge amount of audience today for sticking around and listening to this. If you want to invest in something, do your due diligence, educate yourself on the product. I mean, we didn't even break down today the different psychedelics that have come to market. You know, some of you mentioned psilocybin and ketamine, and we didn't even get into the non-psilocybin mushrooms. You know, that's got its own sector as well. So get to know what you want to invest in, speak to the professionals. You know, Harrison does this every day. He looks at these deals every day and has had to educate himself, and he also knows how to look at these deals. You know, it's really important if you want to invest in anything that you do your work and you build out yourself a due diligence process. And that can involve, you know, even just doing your own research or going to the professionals and doing it. So I really encourage that people do that and appreciate that people come to these forums to learn. We do have a few minutes left for questions, and there is a Q&A box. I've seen a few come through, so I'm going to see if I can get through any of these. Someone did ask how to get a list of the 36 companies that we referenced. I do have one for the CSC, so if you wanted to email me directly, I'm happy to send that out of the issuers that have either they're solely focused or have a focus in the psychedelic space. I don't know about lists on other exchanges, but if anyone has an idea of where to find those.
Psilocybin, not to plug, but
Yeah,
Psilocybin has a very good website.
Yeah.
What is it?
Psilocybin Alpha.
Okay, psilocybin alpha, there you go. I'll go check that out myself. Thank you for that. So I'm gonna let Rick, this comment actually came in particularly for you. It was talking about the share prices being inflated seems to only focus on certain large cap, but the fact is that a lot of small to medium caps are undervalued, which is true. Our markets are already murky waters as it is, especially with the speculative space. And you mentioned FDA approval for psilocybin. but look at small caps like Psych Wellness working with psychoactive compound that is already legal and will be sold on shelves. So this person's just asking what you think of that.
Well, I mean, I think it's just been a underlying theme that I've kind of hopefully not been hammering away too hard at, but I just think that, you know, I spent my career doing relative value. So, you know, sometimes it's difficult to say, you know, what something is worth, but it's a lot easier to look at two assets and say clearly either one is too rich or one is too cheap. You know, I'm a big believer in the space, so I hope that the reality is that everything is cheap and all these things are going to appreciate. But you know, like, you know, when you're looking at a $50 million company, like, you know, that let's say has, you know, 40 kilograms of psilocybin in Alberta and an app with you know 1,000 users, like you have some recovery value, right? And so your downside is just a lot less. There's a lot less that can go wrong. Now, the volatility is going to be a lot higher. The liquidity is a lot lower. You're going to have to deal with, you know, a lot more, you know, sort of bigger moves because, you know, one hedge fund decides that they want to short the stock and the thing can be down 20%. But, you know, if you take a longer term approach, you know, I think that the smaller companies for sure are more attractive and have a lot more optionality. And the larger companies, look, I just don't know. I don't know if they're worth 2 billion or 3 billion or 1 billion, but you know, they're likely not worth 10 billion.
Well, and you touched, I mean, Harrison touched on that too, that it's in the eye of the beholder. The markets are, you know, they're deciding a little bit, but as we go on and this sector starts to, it starts to grow up a little bit, we're going to see lots of ebbs and flows. There's one last question that I'm going to ask before we pass this back over to Paul, is what is the next big catalyst in the space? And we've kind of all touched on what we think is going to happen next, but does anyone want to jump in and say what they think the next big catalyst will be? Any thoughts there? No thoughts?
I think it's the MAPS MDMA right now. Like, I think that's just like the furthest along. And so I think all eyes are going to be on that, as well as, and then, you know, the Oregon situation and all the different, you know, states coming out is going to matter. But I think for the mission at hand, which is, you know, to get these medicines more accessible to all the people, MAPS MDMA phase 3 is going to be at the forefront.
Harrison?
Yeah, exactly. There'll be the legislative side and then actual progress being made on the biotech side.
Josh, any thoughts? Next big catalyst?
I'm on the legislative side because it's going to happen faster by a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I think California is set to have, you know, some level of legality. Oregon already has it. Texas is talking about it. And, you know, it's actually really interesting. Rick said something very, very interesting about, you know, the science and not being able to go backwards from kind of the medicinal dispensary and who's gonna push it. It's a really, really interesting point. I'll be surprised though if we aren't in that position. I think psychedelics are in a better place than cannabis is, because I also think the molecules are being studied more for more indications and dosage and everything else. But that said, I think it's the states legalizing and that'll drive it.
Totally. Greg, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm in the exact same way as the rest of the panel. I think the legalization is going to be huge, and the accessibility for patients to be able to access it.
Well, and you know what, you guys brought up a really good point. If I was to go and want to go out and invest in a bunch of companies right now, what I would do is start to learn about where things are at in that legislative process. So, you know, a good way to understand where the market's at and what's going to happen next. Take a look at what's happening in certain jurisdictions and where they're at with it, and, you know, the companies that might be able to benefit from that. Listen, you guys were amazing. I feel like we could actually sit here all day. Thank you so much for all of your thoughts. And you know, it's a really neat space, and I think it's going to do a lot of good things for society. So I think there's so many good opportunities that will come from it. So I'm excited to watch it play out. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
That's great, Anna.
I'd encourage anybody to reach out if they just want to chat about the space, because I feel like the beauty of this space is that everybody is generally very collaborative and friendly. So you know, please don't hesitate.
Okay, I believe that is going to conclude our third and final panel of the day. I could paraphrase the name of this panel is A Guide for the Perplexed. There is a lot of complexity to investing in this space. I don't think I've ever wanted to unmute myself more in my life than over the course of the last hour. There were so many thoughtful opinions expressed and so many really, I think, forward-thinking notions advanced that it was super exciting. I think I am a big bull, both in cannabis and in psychedelics. I have carpal tunnel syndrome from the amount of checks I've written into both industries over the years. But I will say that I'm going to make a few bold predictions here, and I'll put my name on it. And my first bold prediction is that billions of dollars are going to be made by sophisticated and savvy investors that invest in the right companies. My second prediction is an even greater amount of billions of dollars are going to be lost by other investors that aim their capital in companies that don't make it across the finish line. I will say, as a kind of a business geek, it's a pretty unusual thing to have so many companies that are years away from revenue, if ever, racing to go public. That's a dynamic that you don't see in too many other industries. We're talking about some companies that are pure drug development companies that are still in preclinical, and they're going public, and they're getting valuations that I would say, using any quantitative model I'm familiar with, really hard to fully understand, especially when some of these companies are preclinical. Now, some of them are going to make it all the way across, and they're likely going to be the authors of IP that could create blockbuster drugs that individually could be worth billions of dollars. But there is, just like there was in cannabis way back, a lot of difficulty trying to figure out who is going to make it and who's not. I'll say it's more complicated in psychedelics than in cannabis, because in cannabis, we could at least measure licenses as some measure of a KPI to analyze a company. For a long time, the more licenses you held in the more places, the more highly you were valued. And I would say that we've also seen that thesis, at least in cannabis, held up in some instances and crashed spectacularly in other instances. This is different though, right? This is largely, so far, with the exception of the ketamine clinics that are available right now, and some initiatives like in Oregon where there could be something that looks like a recreational market, this is still largely a drug development industry that's very early on in its development. So it's fascinating, but it's risky too. And I would say for investors, like, you do need to get super educated. You almost need to consider the funds. That's what I used to say to the people that want to invest in cannabis that didn't put years into it, like myself. Find a good fund manager, outsource your capital to them, trust that they're living, breathing, eating, sleeping what is a shape-shifting enterprise. And unless you're that on top of it, you're just bringing, you're courting exceptional risk. Not to say that you will not be right, but this thing, as we all know, is changing by the hour, by the day, by the week, by the month, and it's going to continue to change. And there's counterparty risk because there's regulators all over this industry. So we will say that, I will say that the comparisons to cannabis are somewhat relevant, but in my opinion, they're overstated. This is really different. I would say the two things that the psychedelic industry has in common with the cannabis industry are the CSC and Canaccord Capital, both playing pivotal roles in the underwriting and the listing of these companies, which is a great thing, helping lift these companies, but they are quite different in my opinion. So this is both the thrill, the challenge, the opportunity, and the risk for all investors. I don't think you could have done any better than listening to the leadership and the mastery that we got on today's panel. As someone that does pay attention to this industry, I learned a lot. And I think it's incredible. So I just want to thank the panelists for their incredible contribution to not only today's event, but actually to the overall formation of the industry, that we can say, aside from winners or losers, the real winner of this industry, forgetting about which companies are going to make you rich and which companies are not, are going to be the patients. That's the real win here, is we're going to be able to create transformative modalities that are so superior to what's available to the billions of people that are suffering from some form of mental health crisis right now, whether it's anxiety, insomnia, PTSD, addiction, etc., depression. This is game changing. And we can say at a capital, key level, the psychedelic revolution is going to change the world. And at a micro company level, it's going to be a real challenge to figure out how to invest in this industry, given how early it is. For a lot of people that love disruptive industries, this is a great constellation of events in which to get excited about and deploy capital. You can consider me one of those people. I just want to thank everybody that made today's incredible event possible. That's all the moderators, all the panelists, and all the people behind the scenes at Psychedelics Go and Global Go that helped put this incredible platform together. I particularly want to thank for this panel, Anna, Greg, Rick, Josh, for incredible content. I want to thank also the sponsors that helped make today possible. That's Psychedelics Today, Global Go, the Canadian Securities Exchange, Zuber Lawler, Josh, I'm calling you out there, CFN Media Group, and Psy Index. I hope that all attendees found today as illuminating and as instructive as I did. I'm sure all of the participants would love to speak to you in the after session, which is on right now. There's a breakout link on the chat. Until next time, I'm Paul Rosen. Thank you so much for your passion and your time today.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, everyone.